Welcome to the latest special episode of Five on the Floor as we continue our 2006 commemoration, the 20th anniversary season coming up of the Heat's first championship. Instead of me hosting, some of these episodes will be hosted by Mateo Mayorga, who's been conducting interviews with those who saw it up close. That includes the legendary play-by-play man, Erik Reid. Mateo spent some time recently with Erik, and here are his thoughts. This is sponsored by PrizePicks. Use the code 5, F-I-V-E. Put down your $5, get your 50. And now, today's episode.
Mercy, luxurious, Heat Nation, yeah, Mercy and Lago, down to Biscayne,
Yikes. Five on the floor, ride for my dogs. Where here's the thing, you can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars, wearing bubble frogs.
down to Biscayne.
Kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. And Pat we trust, Inspire have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to Five on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, Alex Toledo, Brady Hawk, and others from the 5 Reasons Sports Network. Also, make sure to subscribe to Off the Floor for the most heat anywhere.
Welcome back to 5 Reasons Sports' continued coverage on the Miami Heat's 2006 season as part of the 20-year anniversary of their first championship. I'm honored to be here today with someone who lived the ride up close. His preparation is second to none. He is a thrice winner of the Florida Sportscaster of the Year award and one of the best play-by-play broadcasters. Four-time winner, and one of the best play-by-play broadcasters in the world. I'm joined by the Miami Heat's Erik Reid. How are you, sir? And please don't hold it against me for butchering it early.
Not at all. My pleasure to be with you. Listen, how fleeting time is. It's hard to believe 20 years have gone by since that first title in 06, but it's like your firstborn, that first championship ingrained in the minds and hearts and souls of everybody that witnessed it.
I see. Right. Erik, starting with official business here in the offseason going into the 2005-2006 year, the team did not bring back or re-sign Keon Dooling and Damon Jones. They traded away Eddie Jones and Rasul Butler. Some of the new blood included Jason Williams, Antoine Walker, James Posey, Gary Payton. How did the new additions fit the DNA of the Miami Heat?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to start with that first season, the year before.
Okay.
The 04-05 season, the first year that Shaquille O'Neal and Dwayne Wade were paired together. It was probably the last best 2 years of Shaq's career. And clearly it was the launch point for Dwayne Wade's ascent to superstardom. His third and fourth years in the league were incredible. He averaged 27 a game in the regular season in both of those seasons. But I think the 05 playoffs gets sort of swept under the rug and really was the precursor to the Heat winning that first championship a year later. Remember, they went up in the conference finals 3-2. I'll never forget the game or a certain moment in that Game 5 win at home at the American Airlines Arena. Dwayne Wade, I'll never forget this. I called it a high point and a low point at the same point. Wade hit a jump shot in the second half of that game, late in the game, to put the Heat up by 20 in Game 5 and injured his rib cartilage on that play. So it was a great victory. It put the Heat a win away from going to the NBA Finals. Wade was the exclamation point, but he got hurt in the game. And I'll never forget going to Detroit for Game 6 and watching him warm up to try to play in that game. He did not play in that game. He played injured and was nowhere near himself in Game 7. And that's what cost Miami a chance to play in the 05 finals, where the Pistons ultimately lost to the San Antonio Spurs in a 7-game series. So you come off that near miss and knowing what may have been your destiny had Wade not gotten injured in Game 5 of the conference finals. You couple that with the 13-player trade that Pat Riley made. You bring in, a former Celtic great in Antoine Walker, a certified point guard and a creative playmaker in Jason Williams, and James Posey, who was, an ideal fit for the Heat culture as a perimeter defender, a 3-and-D guy before there was much in the way of threes. And then, right before the season begins, you'd already picked up Alonzo Mourning on his sort of return to being a Heat player the year before. So you had so many dynamics. A team that came close in 2005, a team that had the top 2 players in their draft year, the 2 iconic college centers, the Russell and Chamberlain of their era, Shaq and Alonzo on the same team. And then you make a trade to bring in 3 veteran guys like we just mentioned. And then right before the season starts in September, you add a Gary Payton and a Jason Capono. Listen, there were championship dreams and aspirations written all over that season. And obviously, on paper, it looked like the greatest team that the franchise had ever put together. So we were all ready for what was to come in that 05-06 season. Great expectations.
Early in the year, game 2, Shaquille O'Neal hurts his right ankle, sprains it rather, against the Indiana Pacers, and it felt like what could have went wrong did go wrong. And when you're missing such a key focal point of your team, it just throws everything so out of whack. But specifically for Dwayne Wade, how did missing someone as potent as Shaquille O'Neal make his life, or his life harder?
Well, listen, when you're top guy, when Shaquille O'Neal, injured early in the season, a new team put together, trying to get on the same page. There were some bumps in the road early, and obviously, listen, that team overall, if you look at the stats from that era of NBA basketball, it was a time where you routinely won by holding teams under 100 points. The Heat averaged less than 100 points per game during that regular season. They only allowed 96 points a game that season. They only averaged 18 3-point attempts in the 05-06 season. So it was a grinded out, different style of play. But that team, like most teams, took some time to get together and got off to a rocky start. And then ultimately, that early season or, close to mid-December coaching change when Stan Van Gundy, surprised everyone by stepping away. And Pat Riley, 2 years removed from coaching in his last game with the Heat, leaves his role just as president of the organization on the basketball side and comes back to be the head coach. So there was a lot that was going on in those first couple of months of that season, most of which was kept behind closed doors. But there was a lot to sort out, and they obviously did.
Erik, when Shaquille O'Neal returned, it was Stan Van Gundy's last game. It was the overtime win against the Washington Wizards. He came off the bench, and the official statement is that he was a voluntary leave. But when Coach Riley returned, what did he have aside from rings that Coach Stan Van Gundy did not?
Well, I don't think it was what he had that Stan. Listen, it would be hard, to draw comparisons. Stan went on to become, an outstanding head coach in the NBA. He was such a great assistant to Pat. How would things have worked out? Nobody knows. But Stan, like Erik Spoelstra did years later, had a framework and a discipline about him, and things were fine. Stan had things going on in his life that he needed to attend to. And, Pat comes in with a credibility and a resume that few others in the history of the sport can boast. He'd been there, done that, and won that with the Lakers. He took Knick teams into title contention. he came to Miami with this in mind. It was almost poetic justice, a cruel twist of fate for Stan to not accompany, what would have been his second team to their first ever championship in franchise history. But Pat took over, and listen, you can go around any sport, the Bill Parcells, the John Woodens. There's so few coaches that Greg Popovich I would put in that category, that by walking into a room can create a feeling, a culture, a karma, a discipline, a vision, and the experience of having been there and done it and won it. And he had all of that on a team that was built to win a championship. So yeah, in some ways, poetic justice that it was Pat that jumped back in and guided the team the rest of that season.
Erik, Coach Spoelstra at this time is an assistant, and he is known for being the guy who would work out extensively and very intensely with Dwayne Wade. How would you describe their relationship or bond at the time?
It was a young Erik Spoelstra planting the seeds, that would, who knew then that he was planting the seeds of what would be his own Hall of Fame coaching career. He's become, one of the longest tenured coaches in the NBA, one of the best coaches in the history of the NBA. And it started in the video room, before Pat Riley arrived with the Miami Heat. And he wasn't he was a basketball guy that learned video, not a video guy learning basketball. But I think it opened everybody's eyes, even back then, how important that role is as working in the video room of an NBA team. It's come a long way since Spo's early days with the Heat in that role. Everything is computerized and high tech. But think about the role of a guy in the video room, or the video coordinator. First of all, they've proven to be the coaches of the future. They're learning everything in the league. They're learning what every team runs. They're learning personnel traits about every single player they watch, both on their team and the teams they're preparing their team to play against. So it's like the perfect entry-level NBA job for somebody that wants to be a future assistant or NBA head coach. So that's how Spo started with the Miami Heat. And I talked about Pat Riley's vision. And one of the things that I've learned, through my experience with the Heat is that being a visionary and seeing first what others have yet to discover is a true gift of the visionary. And Pat Riley certainly had that. Best evidenced by his preparation 4 years out for the free agent summer of 2010. And I think, the recognition of, at that time, a very young coach in Erik Spoelstra, Pat recognized something in him. And while it was a surprise to everyone, in basketball when he got named head coach a few years later, but it was years in the making. So, what you had then back in 2006 was a guy that had graduated from the video room, had become, the Heat specializes in individual instruction for players, player development. This began a long, long time ago. And Spo was, in the grassroots of a guy that was a player developer. And he did form a relationship, an excellent player-coach relationship with Dwayne Wade. He worked with the perimeter guys, and he helped Dwayne improve his game. Dwayne came in so explosive going to the basket, and Spo worked with him on every aspect of his game. And I think it was more than a coincidence, and more than just Dwayne's great talent. He was getting coached up by one of the best young assistants in the game, and by arguably one of the greatest head coaches, to ever take part in the sport.
Incredible level of trust from the work he put in, and definitely earned it. Speaking of Erik Spoelstra, Erik, the Heat's first trainer was Ron Culp. He had a very extensive career. Had worked also with the Portland Trail Blazers in the past. He was in 2006. He was kind of going really through it because his his wife Marilyn got sick, and she later died around the time of the finals. But what can you share about how great Ron Culp was at his job, and what kind of person he was around the team?
Well, first of all, God rest both Ron and Marilyn's souls. Just such significant parts of the Miami Heat story. Marilyn was a special woman who was so involved with the community, such a giving, caring, selfless, unselfish woman in person. And she was the matriarch of the family lounge. Whenever you went up to get a bite to eat before a game or wind down after the game, there was Marilyn with a table full of people, and always there to support and care and listen, and be a part of so many people's stories. It was tragic when she got sick, and we all watched Ron lose his beloved and special wife, Marilyn Culp. That was a huge loss for the Heat family. Ron was a unique guy, with a long and respected history in the league as a trainer. You can imagine all the players he was around, all the stories he was able to both hear, absorb, and tell. I think I got closer to Ron for the simple fact that, for 8 years as a Heat broadcaster, I was paired with the great, late, legendary Hall of Fame coach, Dr. Jack Ramsey. Jack coached the Portland Trailblazers to their only championship in their franchise history, that memorable 1977 team with Maurice Lucas and Bill Walton and Lionel Hollins, Rick Adelman, Bobby Gross. Great team, great series against Dr. J and the Philadelphia 76ers. And Ron Culp was a trainer on that team. And then, he becomes the Heat's first trainer. And he was a perfect, speaking of a former Trailblazer, he was a perfect guy to be a Trailblazer in Miami as NBA basketball came to South Florida in 1988. Guy that had so much experience, took great care of the players, took great pride in his work. At times, he was a tough guy at times, with his personality, but you knew he cared. You knew he put so much into his work, and really cared about the people he worked with and the job he did. And the fact that Jack Ramsey came to the Heat as a broadcaster and they got reunited, it was just a great sort of backstory, as so many stories from that era of Heat basketball.
Erik, transitioning a bit to the playoffs, because the team had a longer than expected cup of coffee with the Bulls after dropping the third and fourth game and beating them in 6. They got past the Nets fairly easily after losing the first, and got past their demons beating. Well, they weren't fully healthy the previous year, but they got past the Detroit Pistons in a 6-game series. They later went to see the Dallas Mavericks. What was the state of the team like after blowing game 1 and getting beat more decisively in game 2 heading to Miami?
Well, first of all, the Heat beat a Bulls team that wasn't one of their great teams, but it was a good team.
Right.
They beat a Nets team that had Jason Kidd, Vince Carter, and Richard Jefferson, probably underrated, and the Heat handled them. Vanquishing the Pistons was just the rite of passage. Remember those Pistons teams with, Rasheed Wallace and Rip Hamilton and Chauncey Billups, and, just great players and just tremendous competition. And to finally get past them, to sort of avenge and atone for coming up short in that series the year before in the conference finals when Wade got hurt. And that's sort of the resume of a champion. Get your heart broke in the playoffs and, come back with greater resolve, greater experience, and a bigger chip on the collective shoulder of the franchise at that time to get past the Pistons. And they did that. A danger of a letdown after beating Detroit? No, man. Not when you're in the NBA finals for the first time ever. There was great expectations. You were playing a Dallas team.
Erik, I'm losing you a little bit. Hello?
top of his game, and he was one of the hardest players there. And Josh Howard, underrated athletic small forward who gave the Heat fits in that series. So, listen, I think, I mentioned the Heat were low, the scores were down. The Heat, as I said, that year, 05-06, averaged under 100 points per game when they struggled at times during the season. And, they did struggle down the stretch of the regular season. In one of our earlier conversations before we had this interview, you mentioned the 6-8 finish to the regular season. I look back at that. In their last 6 losses of the 05-06 regular season, Miami averaged just 86 points per game. In those first 2 losses of the finals at Dallas, Heat scored 80 and 85 points. They lost by 10 and by 14. So remember, back then it was 2-3-2 in how the series was split up. So the first 2 were in Dallas, the next 3 in Miami, and the last 2 games in Dallas. That was the finals format. It was not a great feeling leaving Dallas, coming back to South Florida, down 2-0. And I think that first practice that Pat Riley had with his team as they prepared for the most important game to that point in franchise history, Game 3, 2006 finals, down 2-0. You cannot, if you want to win a championship, afford to lose Game 3 in any way. But it was that practice upon arriving back in Miami, getting ready for Game 3, that Pat Riley, one of his great motivational speeches ever, circled the date on the calendar, June 20th, 2006. He goes, gentlemen, that's the date we're going to win the NBA championship. And that obviously meant 4 straight wins for the Heat to do that. That was the seed of positive thinking that Pat Riley planted in his team's minds and hearts and souls, getting ready for Game 3. And, listen, it's really hard to pick, the game in franchise history. I'm asked that a lot, and I don't usually answer it in this way. A lot of times I say my favorite Heat game was Wade's last regular season game, his triple-double at Brooklyn. But upon further review, I would say that Game 3 in the 06 finals was just the greatest game in franchise history. The Heat in that game, remember, you're down 2-0. They get outscored in the third quarter of that game, 34-16. They're down by 9 heading into the fourth quarter of Game 3. And it's all about those last 12 minutes of that game. And Miami winds up winning the game by 2. Dwayne Wade in that game, there's been so many incredible finals performances in Heat history. I'm not saying it's the best. LeBron had some games, the game in Boston, but this game by Wade, 42 points, 13 rebounds. But what always stands out to me, to win that game by 2, it took a defensive play by Dwayne Wade at the rim with 0.3 of a second left in that game. Nowitzki lobbed it to the rim for the high-flying Josh Howard. The pass looked like it was right on target. And Dwayne Wade, like the best defensive back in NFL history, I mean, that's the kind of play he made, went up above the rim, deflected it away. There was no last-second win by Dallas. It was a play right at the rim. And I say one of the greatest offensive and overall games I've ever seen a Heat player have, yet a defensive play on the very last play of the Game 3 win. The Heat did not lose again in that series. Wade became totally dominant in that series. He took almost I think he didn't have many threes that year. He was not a 3-point threat, but what he was at that time, maybe the best going to the basket player in basketball. And they could not keep him off the foul line in the finals. He took just under 100 free throw attempts in a 6-game series. He took almost 50 free throw attempts in the last 2 games of that series and went on. Listen, he averaged 34 or 35 a game in the finals, but in the 4 wins, it was 40 points per game. It was close to double-figure rebounds. It was tremendous defense. It was a superstar. at the pinnacle of his career, who just dominated on the world's biggest stage. It was only his fourth year in the league. A season and a playoff and a final that is just etched in not only Heat history, but in NBA history. It stands out as the crowning jewel of Dwayne's career. Listen, he went on to play on the 4 straight finals teams and the 12 and 13 teams that won the back-to-back titles. But Dwayne Wade in 06, I mean, those are tapes you got to go back and watch and savor and enjoy and try to never forget. Probably never see anything like that again.
Erik, certainly a legendary performance, specifically that game 3 where they consider their precarious situation, being down 13 points in the last 6 minutes and Wade just going berserk. In that series as well, Shaquille O'Neal was getting double teamed down low, like he was still in his prime. And Coach Pat Riley had said, I believe it was that season, that Shaquille O'Neal is the best passing big man he's ever had out of the post, which is considerable praise because Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was with Pat Riley in Los Angeles. So how did you see Shaquille's passing be a weapon in that series?
Well, listen, Shaquille was about trying to win championships. He was so motivated by rings and huge performances in the biggest games his teams played. He was a savvy veteran player nearing the end of his career. Again, this was his best, late in his career, this was the best 2 years we saw of Shaq. He was smart. He knew what he had in Dwayne Wade, his Batman. He knew what it was going to take to win. He had a veteran team around him, and he was not a selfish player back then. He was just trying to win, facilitate, dominate at times. In the overtime win in game 5 of the finals, I thought he had his best game of that series at 18 points and 12 rebounds. But he didn't have to carry that Heat team like he carried so many other teams. He had the incredible help of Dwayne Wade and just tremendous veteran role players like a Posey and a Jay Will and an Antoine Walker. And a young lion in Udonis Haslem who battled Dirk Nowitzki, every second they were on the court together. These were epic battles. And, one of my favorite moments of the 06 title run was the fact that, listen, Dwayne Wade was the star. Shaquille O'Neal was the celebrated co-star. Pat Riley was, the incredible head coach and president that built it and presided over it. They deserved to be front and center and the headlines. But that night, June 20th, 06 in Dallas, the night the Heat first became NBA champions, I found myself feeling a certain way about 2 individuals that were on that team that I felt almost not more than Shaq or more than Wade, but in an emotional way that meant so much. And I was so happy for them to be a part of that first championship team. Ron Rothstein as an assistant coach, because he was the first head coach in Miami Heat history. And one of the most thankless tasks in the NBA is to be the head coach of an expansion team. And that's what he was. And in that position, you're basically put in a position where you are asked to build a future that you are likely not going to be a part of. And those first 3 years were tough, man. As the Heat were establishing themselves an NBA franchise, they won 15, 18, and 24 games, but started to grow with young players. If you know the beginning of the Heat story, it's sort of a charming one as an expansion team. But for him to come back, he came back and he coached the Miami Soul of the WNBA. And then, a great move by Pat Riley to bring him back in that regard, our first head coach in Heat history. And then he rejoins the staff with Stan Van Gundy. And then he becomes this vital cog as an assistant to both Stan and then ultimately Pat Riley in the championship year. What a just reward for the guy that coached us in those first 3 years of expansion. So happy that Rothstein was there for that first title and is still with the organization today. And of course, Alonzo Mourning, who was the franchise centerpiece. Pat Riley's first bold and big move after becoming president and head coach of the Heat, was to trade with Charlotte for Alonzo, who was really in the prime of his career as an all-NBA center. Just the perfect, fierce, fire-breathing, defensive-minded leader that Pat Riley was going to build his first Heat teams around. And, obviously we all know what Zoe went through. The heartbreaks of losing to the Knicks, all those years in a row, 3 straight years, late in the 90s and heading into 2000. Ultimately, his kidney disease, leaving the Heat to go to the Nets, and then coming back, being paired with Shaquille O'Neal. I'll just never forget how special that was to have the first 2 picks in their draft, the 2 iconic college centers, now later in their NBA journeys on the same team. And, Zoe was just a role player. It was, toward the end of his career. But I called it the most passionate 14 minutes of finals work that I've ever seen. He only played 14 minutes in Game 6 at Dallas. He had 8 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 block shots. And I remember in my sort of fake call of that game for the Heat archives saying something like, does anybody want it more than Zoe? It sure doesn't look like anybody wants it more than him. So to play that role for Rothstein and Mourning, 2 icons of their generation in time and Heat, to be on that first championship team, to me, is just really, really special for them and adds to the history and the treasure of our organization.
Erik, you've been such a rock star, and I just got one more before I let you go here, but just recanting some things about the 2006 final series. Dwayne Wade set a finals record for free throw attempts in the 5th game by taking 25. On top of that, in the second quarter of Game 6, they got very careless with the ball with 8 turnovers, but at one point in the interval, they really cranked it up about 70 degrees, and they ended up outscoring the Mavericks. And it almost felt like one of those moments like in the crucible late in games, because it could have, went so south for them early in that game, and they kept fighting, and they obviously got it done on the road. And that night they were crowned champions. But my last question for you, Erik, is why couldn't that team keep it going further?
Well, first of all, again, of the force of nature that Dwayne was, he was so athletic and explosive, so fierce going to the basket. 46 free throw attempts in games 5 and 6 to win a championship. And he made most of those free throws, and he extended himself on the defensive end. It was the best work of his career. Just a true star in every sense of the word. And he delivered that championship to Miami. And, listen, there are a couple, if I could tell 2 more short stories.
Of course, please.
1 suit, 1 shirt, 1 tie. It's emblazoned in Championship Alley. It's one of the great Pat Riley Heat stories of how is Pat going to deal with his team going into Game 6. Remember, the Heat are up 3-2. They're playing Game 6 at Dallas. If they win the game, they're champs. If they lose the game, it's Game 7 a night later in Dallas. Pat Riley was in this situation with his Knicks team, a few years earlier, and lost to the Houston Rockets in Game 6 and 7 in a series that they were up, I believe, 3-2. He learned a lot from going through that. So with his Heat team, they're leaving the hotel in Dallas to go to Game 6 with that 3-2 lead. And his directive to the team was bags on the bus, meaning we're leaving the hotel. We're not coming back. Bags on. And he said he only brought 1 suit, 1 shirt, and 1 tie. Remember his master plan. We're going to win 4 straight. When he was down 0-2, he tells his team, we're going to be champs June 20th. And now it is June 20th. Bags on the bus, heading to the arena for Game 6. And you know what happened? They did go back to the hotel that night, but it was not to sleep. It was to party and win that championship. So, and they would fly back later that night, in the wee small hours of the morning to Miami. I'll never forget where I was June 20th, 06, sitting in a skybox, again, doing my archive call, for the Heat archives, by myself, doing this call, and the Heat win the championship. I make this crazy call, and we had a Heat broadcast employee by the name of Jason Cohen with us at that time. He was sitting with me, and now we had to make it from the very top of the arena in Dallas down to the floor for the post-game ceremony. And I was out of my mind. Surrounded by disheartened and distraught Dallas fans. I know Jason Cohen feared for our safety on that, escalator ride that seemed like it took forever, but we get to the floor safely. And I'm on the court at the arena in Dallas, and I'm looking at our championship team on the stage, getting ready for the championship ceremony. And who do I see on the back of the stage? My longtime friend, my longtime broadcast partner. We worked for 15 years together, Tony Fiorentino. Somehow he was standing on the back of the stage. Of all the many things I enjoyed with Tony, that is right at the top of the list. I jumped on the back of the stage. That could never happen today. It could never have happened in Miami. It happened that night in Dallas. It's a moment that Tony and I were both so proud and so grateful and so humbled to be Heat lifers, but to have enjoyed that moment, and not in a working role, in just a sheer enjoyment moment, with this team that we've been with from the very beginning, from an expansion team to a championship team. What a unique and coveted journey, and just so blessed that we were on that journey. Pat Riley calls it a forever team. It's a forever moment. It can never be taken away. The challenge, you asked a long time ago in this interview, why couldn't they do it again? It's hard to repeat. And it's hard for me to remember the details of that following year. But Pat Riley put it well. He would say, when you win a championship and you get to the top, that mountaintop in the NBA or in any sport that it is, the human tendency is to want to camp out